Throughout the month of October, we're looking at stewardship or pledging our financial life, and particularly in a spiritual light. We will be looking at it in November and December as we do our budget process in terms of actual numbers, but I want to invite us to think about our giving, our financial giving, and the other ways that we give to community as a spiritual gift, as a spiritual discipline, as part of why we come here in order to be part of something larger. And there are 4 key words associated with each Sunday in October. Last week I did compassion. The word for today is collaboration. Next week, it's creativity. And the final week is empowerment. And you also have in your bulletins a pledge card for 2026. And I want to invite you to fill that out today if you feel comfortable doing so, folding it in half, putting it in the offering plate, or giving it to someone, a staff member or a board member. And these cards help us plan going into the budgeting process what we think our resources will be. It's not a guarantee, but it's our best. It's an important source of information. And what I want to suggest to us today is that these cards are more than a financial pledge. They represent, as I said last week, it was a compassion card. This week, it's a collaboration card. Your commitment to be part of the collaboration of who we are at Congregational Church of the Peninsula. Now, an additional observance for today is National Coming Out Day, and that's a holiday, if you will, or that started back in the 1980s to celebrate with people who were making brave steps at that time to identify as part of what we call today the GLBTQ and allies community, coming out. And then in the late 90s, it became associated also with commemorating the death and life of Matthew Shepard, a young man who was killed in Wyoming by 2 other young men as a hate crime against gay people. It's a complicated story, but one that's important to keep alive in our consciousness and in our memories, because there are attempts today to suppress this story as an important part of our narrative. And I think the connection between collaboration and Coming Out Day is this, that collaboration means it's essential to community. It's working together. It's being part of a group. And coming out is only safe when there is a collaboration to come into. Jose Antonio Vargas is a well-known Bay Area journalist who is also undocumented, who grew up in Los Altos, talks about how Coming Out Day isn't just about our coming out, if you will, but about our inviting others in. And I think that's true, that coming out is a gift that we bring, not a problem to be solved. And coming out is also, I think, applies to something broader than simply saying, I'm gay, or I'm lesbian, or I'm non-binary, I'm transgender. It reflects a larger process. Any change that we make for ourselves that leads to liberation for ourselves and for others is a kind of coming out. Any insight, any declaration that we make that frees us and frees others is a coming out, if you will. I think we all have coming out stories, moments in our lives when we're able to see things differently than we had seen them previously, and where we're able to express them in a way that increases or enriches the community around us. So coming out has a very particular meaning, and it is applied to the remembrance of Matthew Shepard. It also has an important piece of history in the United Church of Christ in this area that I want to be sure that we don't forget our history around. In 1972, Bill Johnson, a graduate then of Pacific School of Religion, was a member of the San Carlos Church. And he declared himself to be openly gay. And for the first time in the history of the United Church of Christ, that didn't end his ordination process. And the San Carlos Church, and all of us who are in the Golden Gate Association, the cluster of Congregationalist churches on this side of the bay became involved in a conversation that led to an historic event. It didn't happen easily, didn't happen without conflict, but the group of churches decided for the first time in the history of the Congregational Church to call an openly gay person to be a minister. And that had a huge impact, not only in the rest of the UCC churches around the country, but also in liberal Protestant churches everywhere. It also resonated deeply in the gay community. At that time, and I was a member of one of these churches and a minister, as you know, there were separate churches for gay people called metropolitan community churches. And it drew the attention of the gay people in the separate churches that maybe someday we can be part of the we that we had to leave in order to be who we are. Then, because there's something in the water in Northern California, just a few years later, in 1977, in the Congregational churches, or the UCC churches, 3 women presented themselves for ordination. And these 3 women, who were class of 77 at Pacific School of Religion, Stacy Casolas, Jody Parsons, Loie Powell, presented themselves together as a team for ordination, and one of them was a lesbian. And they did this in part so that they couldn't be told no. And even though the church said yes once to Bill Johnson and didn't let him work in the church for 15 years afterwards, they had not yet said yes to a lesbian to be called to ministry. So again, right here in Northern California, these 3 women, through collaboration, presented themselves as a team. They said, say yes to all of us or say no to all of us, but we're standing together. They presented one ordination paper together as a team, and in 1978, they were ordained also in the Northern California Conference, echoing throughout the United Church of Christ. And then, a few years later, Wendy Taylor became one of the first called lesbians to work in a parish church in the United Church of Christ. And guess where that was? This church, Congregational Church of Belmont. So I just wanted to say that. I think there should be like a little monument on the outside of the church that says, as dear as this church is to the people here, it means a lot to LGBTQ people in the church all around throughout our denomination. Sometimes collaborations that begin small have a huge impact way beyond the people who are involved could ever have predicted. So that's another collaboration piece I wanted to lift up that we are actually a part of. I went this week to a housing conference in Sunnyvale. And boy, it's a long drive from from Oakland to Sunnyvale, I'll tell you. I think I could have flown more quickly. But it was a gathering of churches from San Mateo County and Santa Clara County, being willing, and not just churches, synagogues also, being willing to look at what could we achieve together over time in our region using our resources. I was proud to represent the Congregational Church of the Peninsula. I proudly read our new mission statement that's on the back of the bulletin and was able to share how we could see how this mission could connect to a community who was willing to look at housing as a human rights issue in our county. And I felt like I was doing a public debut for the mission statement, and people were very intrigued. I also was there as a speaker because I have a long history of involvement in housing issues. Some of you know I'm on the board of a project in Oakland, building 90 units of affordable housing. And then before that, in San Francisco, I did this work as part of my work at the Metropolitan Church there. And this is the story I want to tell you about the impact of collaboration. As part of that, I talked about how we established a queer youth shelter in the Castro district of San Francisco in our church building in the mid-90s. And it was a city program. We weren't being overly bold, but no one had ever done it in the Castro neighborhood, which is considered a wealthy neighborhood in the city. And generally, what people there preferred was that we would offer programs like this city program in other neighborhoods. In fact, people offered me thousands of dollars if we would locate that program for queer youth in the Tenderloin and not in the Castro neighborhood. And it was a 10-week winter program. Let me just add, it wasn't building housing. It was just the 10 weeks when it rains in San Francisco to provide housing for queer youth, any youth really under 18. And there are a lot of them from all around the country who are living on the streets still of San Francisco. So there was a lot of neighborhood opposition to this. There was also more prevailing, a lot of neighborhood support for it. But this woman came up to me on Wednesday at the conference I was at, and she said, I was a student at the school on Collingwood, on Diamond Street, one block over, the Live Oak School, during the time of this. And I was so moved, and my parents supported this project, but I was so moved that a church would take on such opposition in order to provide housing for people my age who came from different kinds of circumstances. And she said it was there that my desire to work as a housing activist was born. Here we were 30 years later in Sunnyvale, and what I learned from that was that the teens are watching. They're watching what commitments we make, what collaborations they make, and even if it doesn't affect them personally, it can have an impact in later life. Housing only happens because of collaborations, because of people working together in order to make all the moving parts that are required to provide relief for the unhoused, both in the short term and the long term. I've been really impressed by our Circle of Care. It's the immigration support group that meets, that's part of our church, that also gives funds, among other things, to people who are caught in our current immigration situation. How they take each circumstance carefully and try to analyze how the resources of this congregation can make a difference at this time. And I saw it again this week, making a difference in what's happening to people who are caught in what's happening in our immigration system. That's a collaboration that I hope we all feel proud of and part of for what's happening here. This is what I found in the Bible story about the importance of collaboration. We're using the same Bible story each week, a different version or a different paraphrase or a different translation. But it's essentially about the feeding of 5,000 people, however you want to call it, the miracle of the feeding of 5,000. Sometimes the church calls it. I don't like to use miracle in that regard because sometimes I think when we hear the word miracle, we think that's something that God does supernaturally, but that we could never achieve somehow, that we don't play a role in. But this story shows the intersection of divine and human activity to achieve something that doesn't seem possible on the surface, but because people collaborate, they're able to do. This part picks up, we used this story last week and we'll be using it again. But when the people traveling with Jesus notice the hunger of the people around them, and they say, since it's evening, send them away. We don't want to take care of this situation. And Jesus says, no, don't send them away. Look at them. See them. That was the compassion part. See them. You feed them. And they respond, well, surely you don't expect us to spend a lot of money on feeding these other people. Are you serious? I love this translation that says, are you serious? Can you just hear them saying, are you serious? The incredulity. And Jesus says, well, how many loaves of bread do you have? Take an inventory. Look at your resources and see what your resources could yield. And their initial response is, well, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But Jesus, after urging them to work together, has them arrange themselves in groups of 50 or 100. That's the size of a typical church these days. And, and
Yes.
somehow, they have enough food for one another. It isn't initially apparent when they inventory their material resources, but perhaps it causes them to look at what other resources they might have. Perhaps it causes more generosity. It engenders generosity. Collaboration can engender generosity. And the initial estimate of 5 fish, well, it turns out there is actually enough fish and enough bread to feed everyone. So it calls out good things from one another, and they're able to have more than they think. And I just love this image, a patchwork quilt of wildflowers spread out like on the grass. What they must have looked like. They looked like compassion. They looked like collaboration. And there's a beauty to compassion and collaboration when they're joined together. There's another snippet here just of Jesus, again, commissioning a different kind of model. Don't do it yourself. He sends 72 out in pairs to make a difference and appeals to their sense of vision. Look, there's a lot out there that we can do, but you can't do it alone. What do we know about collaboration? It isn't transactional. The question, if we start with the question, what are we going to get from this? It won't lead to collaboration. If they're looking at, as these disciples are initially, well, how can we feed them? How are we going to be able to feed them with such small resources? But because they look with the eyes of compassion and because they work in collaboration, they are able to achieve something that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to achieve. And they don't ask, what can I get for it? But rather, who will benefit or how will other people benefit from it? That doesn't mean that we're not part of the benefit, but it doesn't start with only what am I going to get out of it? Collaboration makes mystical things happen, and it does require more work sometimes than doing it by ourselves. We all have some area in our lives where we think, I could do this better, more quickly, more efficiently, if I didn't have to work with other people. And it's a trap, and Jesus recognizes it as a trap. If our first thought is, I can do this better myself, I'm saying this to myself too, then it's time to stop for a moment and take inventory, personal inventory if necessary, and say, what would it take for me to reframe this situation to how can I work with others? How can I ask for help if I need help, rather than to pretend I don't need it and I'm doing this alone? It leads to isolation. It leads to frustration and resentment. Jesus is offering a different model, collaboration. Do it with others and resist the notion that I could do it better myself as a spiritual act, as a spiritual discipline. I want to lift up Chocolate Fest next week and suggest an alternative name for it, Collaboration Fest. It is also Chocolate Fest, and it's all about the chocolate, and I can't wait, personally. But it is an amazing achievement that a small group of people is able to raise as much money and as much visibility and as much cool energy as we are able to do it. And it works best when we do it collaboratively. It is a part of being in community that sometimes there's conflict. And sometimes, almost inevitably, there's tension. And that happens here. I'll just be frank, right? And I'm part of it. So I'm saying that it's we, it's us. We are capable of great, beautiful, miraculous things when we collaborate. But when we isolate, it falls apart. So as we enter into our biggest event of the year, Collaboration Fest, I want to invite us to all do it with kind hearts, with forgiving spirits, with generous hearts. And at any given point in the week, if we're tempted to feel isolated, or if we're feeling isolated, or if we are isolated, to reach out for help, and to cut each other slack and to demonstrate to ourselves and to one another what we are capable of when we do something collaboratively as a spiritual act. And I believe it will, I know it will be a financial success, and I believe it will be a collaboration success. But I wanted to say it at the beginning rather than look back on it later and wish that I had drawn it to our attention. There's a proverb that came with part of our Changemaker series, if we want to be change makers. And it's this, you probably heard it. If you want to go fast, do it alone. If you want to go far, do it together. Let that be our guide this week, our collaboration North Star, guiding star, as we work together to make a miracle happen in Belmont.